In war, victory often belongs not to the strongest army, but to the cleverest. In the spring of 1944, while the world's eyes fixed on the beaches of Normandy, a handful of young American artists, sound engineers, and illusionists were preparing to fight the war in a way no one had ever imagined, with deception. They were not soldiers in the traditional sense. They didn't storm beaches or charge machine gun nests. Instead, they carried paintbrushes, loudspeakers, and rubber. Their mission: convince the German army that shadows were real, that silence was noise, and that what they saw was not what it was. This is the story of the Ghost Army, the most creative, audacious, and secretive deception unit of the Second World War. The problem Eisenhower faced by 1944, the Allied war effort had turned the tide in Europe. The Soviets were advancing from the east, the British and Americans were preparing to invade from the west. But to land in France successfully, the Allies needed to do something no general had ever done before. They needed to convince the Germans that the invasion was coming, just not where it really was. Hitler's high command was certain that the main invasion would strike Pas-de-Calais, the shortest distance across the English Channel. It made sense. Calais was the closest point between Britain and France, well defended, and within range of Allied aircraft. But the true landing point would be Normandy, farther west, an area the Germans considered less likely. To ensure success, Supreme Allied Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower needed to keep the Germans guessing until the very last moment. Enter a small group of men from the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, the Ghost Army. A different kind of army, the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops were activated in January 1944. Their ranks included only about 1,100 men, tiny compared to a real division. But on paper, they were meant to look like 30,000. They drew their recruits from the U.S. Army's engineer, signal, and artillery units, but many of these young men had unusual civilian backgrounds: art students from New York, sound engineers from Hollywood, theater designers from Philadelphia, and even a few who would later become famous names in American art, like Ellsworth Kelly and Bill Blass. Their purpose wasn't to fight, but to fool. Their tools weren't rifles and tanks, but inflatable decoys, sound trucks, and radio trickery. They were professional illusionists with military precision. Their mission: create fake divisions using inflatable tanks and artillery. Simulate radio traffic of entire corps headquarters. Broadcast fake battle sounds, engines, troop movements, construction noises over miles of countryside. And, most dangerously, move close enough to German lines to be convincing without getting caught. Everywhere they went, they carried a single idea: if you can fool the enemy, you can save lives. Operation Fortitude, the greatest deception in modern history. The Ghost Army's origins trace back to the Allied deception strategy called Operation Bodyguard, designed to protect the real D-Day invasion plan. One branch of that operation, known as Operation Fortitude, aimed to make the Germans believe that the main invasion would happen at Pas-de-Calais, not Normandy. To achieve that illusion, the Allies created an entirely fake army, the 1st U.S. Army Group, FUSAG, supposedly under the command of the charismatic General George S. Patton, who was then sidelined for slapping a soldier in Sicily. Patton's reputation as an aggressive field commander made him the perfect decoy. German intelligence believed wherever Patton was, the main attack would follow. So, while Eisenhower quietly prepared for Normandy, Patton and his army, made up of the Ghost Army's inflatable divisions, appeared to be gathering across from Calais. The deception was elaborate and convincing. Inflatable Sherman tanks lined British fields, rubber aircraft sat on fake airstrips, and even wooden landing craft bobbed off the coast. Dummy radio operators transmitted encrypted messages day and night, creating the illusion of troop buildup. From the air, it looked entirely real. And the Germans bought it. Inside the illusion, the first time the Ghost Army deployed their inflatable divisions in the field was in early 1944, in England. Working under cover of secrecy, they filled entire fields with what looked like hundreds of tanks, trucks, and artillery pieces. Each tank, made of rubberized canvas, could be inflated in less than 30 minutes using a small air compressor. Once set up, they were painted with mud and camouflage nets to look battle-worn. From a few hundred yards away, or from a reconnaissance plane, they were nearly indistinguishable from real armor. To complete the illusion, sound engineers from Bell Labs recorded actual battlefield noises: tank engines idling, tracks grinding, men shouting orders. These sounds were played back through massive 500-watt amplifiers mounted on jeeps, capable of projecting sound up to 15 miles. An unsuspecting German patrol could easily believe they were facing a division of tanks preparing to strike. One Ghost Army sergeant later recalled, "We'd pull up near the front, set up a few dozen rubber Shermans, start the sound trucks, and the Germans would start shelling empty fields. We'd just laugh and move on." The soldiers often worked within range of enemy artillery. A single misstep, an observation plane flying too close, a patrol wandering too far, and the entire illusion could be exposed. Yet they carried out dozens of operations without their secret ever leaking. The art of the fake. Every aspect of the Ghost Army's work was crafted to appear authentic. If they were impersonating an armored division, they'd paint the proper insignia on the vehicles. They'd send fake mail, stencil unit numbers on trucks, and even distribute counterfeit reports and gossip through local civilian channels, all to reinforce the deception. They became experts in mimicry. Radio operators learned the communication styles and rhythms of other divisions. Artists studied camouflage patterns and the silhouettes of German armor. Tailors stitched patches and armbands to match every possible division. In some cases, Ghost Army soldiers went into nearby towns in uniform, pretending to be officers from other units, dropping hints of impending operations to any civilian who might talk to German spies. As one veteran later put it, "We were actors. The battlefield was our stage. And the Germans were our audience." Their performances were convincing enough to redirect German units away from real Allied movements, saving thousands of lives. The high stakes of deception. By June 1944, the deception had reached its climax. As D-Day approached, the Ghost Army's fake divisions helped convince the Germans that the Normandy landings were merely a feint. The 15th German Army, under Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, kept its armored divisions in reserve near Calais, waiting for patterns of real invasion that never came. This hesitation proved catastrophic for the German defense. By the time Hitler realized Normandy was the true invasion site, it was too late. Allied forces had established a firm beachhead, and reinforcements were pouring in. The Ghost Army's success didn't end with Normandy. In the months that followed, they continued to operate across France and into Germany, staging over 20 deception missions between 1944 and 1945. Their illusions drew enemy fire, confused reconnaissance, and masked troop withdrawals and advances. But in the early days, before anyone knew whether their methods would work, there was a constant fear of discovery. The men joked that if the Germans ever realized their tanks were made of rubber, they'd be shot on sight as spies. One veteran remembered inflating a tank near the front lines when a French farmer walked by, astonished. He looked at us, then at the tank, and said, "Your army is very strange." We just nodded and kept pumping. An army of artists. The Ghost Army's members were unlike any other soldiers in the US Army. They came from art schools, design firms, and advertising agencies. They were illustrators, photographers, sculptors, sound engineers, and set designers. In civilian life, they might have designed billboards or Broadway sets. In wartime, they applied those same creative instincts to fool one of the most disciplined military machines in history. Among them were men who would later shape American art and design for decades. Bill Blass would go on to become one of America's most famous fashion designers. Ellsworth Kelly became a pioneering modern artist. Arthur Singer, who painted camouflage for fake tanks, later illustrated nature books and postage stamps. Their artistry was their weapon. And though few outside the unit knew of their existence, their work played a crucial role in confusing German intelligence during the most critical months of the European campaign. The veil of secrecy. For decades after the war, the Ghost Army's story remained classified. The men were sworn to secrecy, their missions were buried in archives. It wasn't until the mid-1990s that official recognition began to surface, and historians started piecing together the full extent of their deception operations. Many of the surviving veterans didn't even tell their families what they had done. When the story finally emerged, it read like a Hollywood script, an improbable but true tale of art defeating steel. The Ghost Army's success wasn't just in the illusions they created, it was in the lives they saved. By deceiving the Germans about troop movements, they diverted artillery, drew fire away from real divisions, and prevented countless ambushes. In the words of one commander, every German shell that landed on an inflatable tank was one less that hit an American soldier. They were young, creative, and brave. But the story of the Ghost Army was only beginning. After Normandy, their missions would grow bolder, closer to enemy lines, more dangerous, and more critical than ever before. They had fooled the enemy from across the Channel. Now, they would have to do it face to face, deep inside Europe itself. The German army had long believed it could read the American mind. Their intelligence branches, the Abwehr and later the Fremde Heer West, were confident that the US command moved like a hammer, big, noisy, and straightforward. When the Wehrmacht analysts pored over reconnaissance photos of Allied positions in France during the summer of 1944, they thought they could see the story unfolding as clearly as a map. But they couldn't. They were staring directly at a mirage, an illusion crafted by a handful of American artists, engineers, and radio men who had transformed deception into a battlefield weapon. The Phantom Army moves to France by late June 1944, with the Normandy invasion underway. The Allied command knew the battle for France would depend not only on real divisions but on the illusion of many more. The 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, known only by a select few in the chain of command, crossed the Channel soon after D-Day. Their mission: confuse, mislead, and manipulate the German high command at every turn. The Germans already believed there were far more American units in Europe than truly existed. It was now up to this ghost army to make those false divisions come alive. They were headquartered near Normandy, and their ranks were filled not with hardened infantrymen, but with illustrators from New York, sound engineers from Hollywood, and art students from Philadelphia. Men like Bill Blass, who would later become one of America's most famous fashion designers, now found himself standing in a muddy French field, directing the placement of inflatable Sherman tanks and rubber artillery guns. Their real weapons were canvas, air compressors, and sound recordings, and their battleground was the imagination of the enemy. Operation Brest, the first test in August 1944, the battle for Brest became the Ghost Army's proving ground. The Germans still occupied several fortified ports along the Atlantic, and American generals wanted to convince them that a much larger force was encircling them than actually existed. The 23rd Special Troops went to work. Using massive air compressors, they inflated hundreds of dummy vehicles in open fields where Luftwaffe reconnaissance planes could easily spot them. From the air, it looked like a powerful armored division preparing for an assault. At night, teams unrolled loudspeakers, some as large as truck engines, and played pre-recorded battle sounds, the metallic clanking of tank treads, shouted commands, trucks idling in convoys, even distant gunfire. The sound system could project noise up to 15 miles away, simulating an entire division on the move. German scouts reported these movements faithfully back to their commanders, who repositioned forces to counter a threat that didn't exist. Meanwhile, real American units slipped through other routes, seizing ground while the enemy focused on the Phantom. For the first time, deception saved thousands of Allied lives. The illusion expands across Europe. The success in Brittany opened new possibilities. By September 1944, as the Allies pushed toward Belgium and the German border, the Ghost Army was called upon again, this time near the Siegfried Line. Their mission: to impersonate the 9th Army and mask the movements of General Patton's 3rd Army to the south. They arrived under secrecy, setting up fake bivouacs, fuel dumps, and command posts. Using paint and canvas, they handcrafted convincing unit insignias on trucks and jeeps. Soldiers stenciled markings from real divisions, then drove conspicuously along roads where German spotters would see them. They even went as far as to send phony radio traffic, entire networks of Morse operators, imitating real signals from legitimate divisions. Every message, every broadcast, was part of a calculated script written by US Army deception planners in London. The men of the Ghost Army weren't improvising, they were performing a military play, with the enemy as their unwilling audience. The artists of war to the average soldier, it seemed absurd, men painting fake shadows on rubber tanks, or hammering wooden boards under jeeps to simulate tracks of heavy vehicles. But this was more than art, it was psychological warfare. Each operation required intense coordination between sound engineers, radio operators, and visual deception teams. They moved constantly, often within hundreds of yards of the front line. The danger was real. German artillery could strike without warning, and Luftwaffe fighters still prowled the skies. Private Fred Fox, one of the unit's writers, later said, "We weren't trained to kill the enemy. We were trained to make him think he was being attacked from the wrong place." And it worked. Captured German officers later admitted that their maps and intelligence reports often contained units that had never existed, entire divisions that the Ghost Army had conjured into being with air and sound. A game of shadows in Luxembourg in late 1944, the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops took part in one of their most daring deceptions yet, Operation Bettembourg, in Luxembourg. The US 4th Armored Division had been ordered south to reinforce Patton's drive toward Bastogne during the Battle of the Bulge, but the Germans couldn't be allowed to notice its absence. The Ghost Army stepped into the void. In just 48 hours, they transformed a quiet sector into a convincing front line. Dozens of inflatable tanks were placed in open meadows. Truck convoys drove in looping circuits to simulate heavy traffic. At night, engineers lit campfires in regimented patterns. To any German observer peering through binoculars from the hills, it looked and sounded like the 4th Armored was still holding position. Behind the illusion, however, Patton's real tanks were racing through snow and mud toward the Ardennes. When the Germans finally advanced into the Bettemborg area, they found nothing but empty fields and rubber tanks collapsing under the wind. The deception had held long enough to buy Patton the time he needed. Psychological warfare becomes an art form. By early 1945, the Ghost Army had honed their craft into something nearly untraceable. Each deception used for coordinated layers, visual, dummy tanks, planes, and artillery visible to aerial scouts. Sonic, powerful loudspeakers blasting recordings of movement and battle. Radio, counterfeit Morse code mimicking Rael division chatter. Atmospheric, fake headquarters signs, marked vehicles, and even staged encounters in nearby towns to spread rumors among civilians and spies. Everything fit together like an elaborate performance. They studied German reconnaissance habits, knowing that even a misplaced tent or tire track could break the illusion. The soldiers even practiced how to act like members of the divisions they were impersonating, adopting their slang, posture, and routines. One officer later recalled, "We became the 6th Armored, then the 9th Infantry, then the 75th, all in 1 month. We were actors on the world's most dangerous stage." The Germans begin to suspect by March 1945. As Allied armies approached the Rhine River, German intelligence officers began to suspect something uncanny. Their reconnaissance flights revealed American divisions in places that didn't make sense. Units reported destroyed were suddenly seen again, and others appeared in multiple locations at once. Field Marshal Walter Model, one of Hitler's most trusted tacticians, reportedly grew frustrated at the conflicting reports. He believed Allied intelligence was outmaneuvering his own, but he couldn't pinpoint why. The Ghost Army had become so convincing that their operations distorted German strategy itself. In several cases, the Wehrmacht redirected entire corps to defend against attacks that would never come, wasting precious time and fuel in the final months of the war. Preparing for the final illusion in late March 1945, as the Allies closed in on Germany, the 23rd received their most ambitious assignment yet, Operation Viersen. Their mission, to draw German attention away from the real American crossing of the Rhine by making them believe a massive armored assault was forming 20 miles north of where it actually would. The deception would involve more than 1,000 men, 600 inflatable vehicles, and a fully functional fake command post. The Ghost Army had only 48 hours to set up. Every man knew the stakes. If the ruse failed, the Germans would concentrate their artillery on the real crossing and potentially kill thousands of Allied soldiers. They began inflating tanks through the night, while sound trucks blared engine noises along the riverbanks. Radio operators transmitted streams of coded chatter simulating orders between non-existent battalions. To anyone listening, it sounded like an entire army preparing to storm the Rhine. As dawn broke over the fog-shrouded river, German spotters on the far bank peered through their field glasses and saw precisely what the Americans wanted them to see, a phantom invasion force ready to strike. Operation Viersen, the last great deception. March 1945. The Rhine River, a dark, winding line through the heart of Germany, had become the last natural barrier between the collapsing Reich and the Allied armies closing in from the west. To Hitler, it was sacred ground. To the Allies, it was the final obstacle before victory. And on that fog-soaked frontier, the men of the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, the Ghost Army, prepared their greatest illusion of the war. The operation was called Viersen, named for a small German town just west of the river. The goal was simple but perilous: convince the Wehrmacht that the Americans intended to cross the Rhine north of Düsseldorf, while the real crossing would take place miles to the south. If the deception worked, German artillery would be aimed at empty fields. If it failed, thousands of American soldiers might die in the river. The men knew the stakes, and they knew this was their final curtain call. Setting the stage on March 18, under the cover of darkness, convoys rolled into a narrow sector along the Rhine's western bank. Trucks unloaded inflatable Sherman tanks, rubber jeeps, and dummy artillery. Canvas tents popped up overnight, arranged in perfect military precision. Engineers hammered down wooden planks to mimic tank tracks, while sound trucks positioned themselves in concealed tree lines. Radio operators set up in barns and church basements, broadcasting an intricate web of fake communication, coded messages that mimicked entire regiments. To the enemy across the river, the air filled with noise and motion. Spotters peered through binoculars and saw what looked unmistakably like a U.S. armored division massing for an assault. But in truth, there were barely 1,100 men in the entire Ghost Army, the same number that would normally make up a single infantry battalion. It was theater. Theater performed in mud and danger, with life and death consequences. The mirage across the Rhine, every deception had to be believable. The Germans were seasoned at spotting tricks, they'd fallen for feints before, but never twice in the same way. So the 23rd refined their craft. Inflatable tanks were deliberately weighted down with sandbags so their tracks pressed naturally into the soil. Fuel cans were scattered near tents. Cooking fires burned through the night, their smoke drifting lazily over the river. At sunrise, sound engineers triggered recordings of tanks rumbling to life. Loudspeakers blasted orders, engine revs, and the metallic rhythm of tracked vehicles. Even the timing of the noises was calculated: morning briefings, evening vehicle movements, and nighttime idling. From the East Bank, German forward observers heard it all. They radioed headquarters, enemy armor building up near Viersen. Strong presence. Possible crossing within 48 hours. The illusion was complete. The real crossing, and the German trap. While the Ghost Army played its part to perfection, real divisions, including the 9th Army under General William Simpson, were preparing for the actual crossing, 20 miles south, near Wesel. On the night of March 23, Allied artillery thundered in coordinated barrages along the entire Rhine line. The Ghost Army joined in, firing blanks and pre-recorded detonations to simulate massive bombardments. Then, under cover of smoke, real combat engineers began building pontoon bridges at Wesel, far from where the Germans expected them. By the time the Wehrmacht realized what was happening, it was too late. The 9th Army had crossed the Rhine virtually unopposed. German units stationed opposite the Ghost Army, expecting a full invasion at Viersen, waited in confusion, staring across empty waters. The deception had worked with surgical precision. A silent victory. When General Omar Bradley received reports of the successful Rhine crossing, he reportedly smiled and said, "The best battle is one the enemy never fights." For the Ghost Army, that was their victory, not through destruction, but through avoidance. Every German shell fired at a rubber tank was one less fired at a real soldier. The 23rd Headquarters Special Troops had now completed 21 deception operations across Europe, each one a silent maneuver that shaped the course of the war. Yet, for security reasons, their existence remained classified. Even many frontline commanders never knew who had saved them from enemy fire. They packed up their equipment in silence, deflated their tanks, and prepared for their next mission inside Germany itself. The last march east. By April 1945, the German army was crumbling. Towns once proudly defended now surrendered at the first sight of American columns. Refugees flooded the roads. The Luftwaffe was all but gone. The Ghost Army followed the real front into the Rhineland and central Germany, sometimes entering newly captured towns within hours of their liberation. In Kassel, they staged another decoy, a false command post meant to disguise the 9th Army's real headquarters. Though the fighting was nearly over, danger still lurked. German artillery occasionally shelled their positions, unaware that the men they were firing on were artists and radio operators, not infantrymen. Some of the ghost soldiers wrote in their journals that they felt a strange melancholy. The war was ending, yet their peculiar mission, their art of illusion, was ending with it too. They had played their parts perfectly. Now, as the stage lights dimmed, they packed their paint, their compressors, their recordings, and waited for orders that would never come. The war's end, and vanishing into silence. When Germany finally surrendered in May 1945, the men of the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops were scattered across Europe. They were ordered to keep silent about their work. Their unit records were locked away. To the world, they were simply another special operations group, unremarkable among millions of returning veterans. For decades, their story remained unknown. Even their families were unaware of what they'd done. It wasn't until 1996, more than 50 years later, that the Ghost Army's operations were officially declassified. By then, many of the men were old, grey-haired, retired, their youthful exploits remembered only in fragments of letters and photographs. But when their story finally came to light, historians recognized the scale of what they'd achieved. They had created an entirely new form of warfare, one where sound, light, and art became as powerful as bullets. The men behind the illusion. Among the 1,100 soldiers of the 23rd, many would go on to become artists, architects, designers, and teachers. Bill Blass, who once painted camouflage netting over dummy vehicles, became one of America's most famous fashion designers. Ellsworth Kelly, who built false bridges and painted deceptive shadows, went on to become a leading abstract artist. Arthur Singer, who drew vehicle markings and signage, would later illustrate some of the most recognized field guides in the country. Their wartime service had blurred the line between art and survival, a lesson they carried for the rest of their lives. As one veteran later said, "We used creativity to fight tyranny." That's something to be proud of. The Germans reflect after the war. Captured German officers were interviewed about the Allied deception campaigns. Many admitted they had been outmaneuvered by imagination. General Hasso von Manteuffel, a respected tank commander, told interrogators that he had often acted on false intelligence, reports of divisions that never existed. For a nation that prided itself on precision and order, it was a humbling realization that they had been undone not just by overwhelming firepower, but by cleverness, by the audacity of men who waged war through illusion. Legacy of Shadows. The Ghost Army's impact didn't end in 1945. Their techniques laid the foundation for modern psychological operations, influencing Cold War strategy, NATO deception planning, and even modern-day military camouflage. Yet their story remained in the shadows until recent decades, when veterans began speaking publicly about what they'd done. In 2022, the U.S. Congress finally awarded the Ghost Army a Congressional Gold Medal, recognizing their extraordinary contribution to Allied victory. The medal's inscription reads, "For their unique, highly distinguished service in conducting deception operations that saved countless lives." For those who had lived through it, the recognition came late, but it came. Reflections on illusion and courage. The Ghost Army had fought a different kind of war, one where courage meant standing unarmed within earshot of the enemy, trusting that your trick would hold long enough to save others. They were soldiers, yes, but also dreamers, artists, and thinkers who believed creativity could win battles as surely as gunfire. Their story is a reminder that in the darkest moments of history, human ingenuity can still find light. As one veteran said, decades later, standing beside a rusted air compressor once used to inflate tanks, we didn't have to kill to make a difference. We just had to make them believe. After the smoke cleared Europe, May 1945. The guns finally fell silent. The rumble of tanks faded into the distance. Smoke drifted over broken towns, and the rivers, once black with oil and blood, began to run clear again. The soldiers of the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, the men behind the illusion, watched from their scattered camps as the world they had deceived slowly righted itself. They were not on the front page of any newspaper. No general saluted them in the streets. There were no parades for the men whose greatest victories had to remain invisible. But they knew the truth. In a war defined by destruction, they had fought with imagination and saved thousands of lives without firing a shot. A silence that lasted decades after Germany's surrender. The Ghost Army was quietly disbanded. Their files were sealed under top-secret classification, marked "Do Not Disclose." For years, even their families knew nothing. When veterans returned home, they blended into civilian life, artists, students, designers, and engineers resuming their interrupted lives. Some went back to school on the GI Bill, others married, started families, or opened studios. And when people asked what they had done in the war, they simply said, "Oh, I was in Europe." There was pride in their silence, but also a weight. They couldn't speak of the nights they'd spent inflating rubber tanks in the rain, or the fear that came when real shells landed too close to their stage. They couldn't explain how it felt to outwit an army, to stand beneath artillery fire and know their only defense was illusion. For decades, their secret remained buried in the National Archives, an untold story of deception, courage, and artistry. The rediscovery in the mid-1980s, a handful of historians stumbled upon fragments of records labeled 23rd Headquarters Special Troops. The files were incomplete, but what they revealed astonished them. Here were reports, sketches, and photos of inflatable vehicles and dummy camps scattered across France, Belgium, and Germany. There were sound diagrams, radio logs, and after-action summaries describing enemy units' deceived anti-diversionary success. The historians realized they had uncovered something unprecedented, a secret American unit whose battlefield was made of smoke and mirrors. In the years that followed, surviving veterans began to come forward. One by one, they told their stories of sound men who carried 500-pound speakers through mud to broadcast fake battles, of painters and sculptors who built entire armies out of air and canvas, of radio operators who created the illusion of thousands of soldiers with nothing more than Morse code and timing. For the first time, the world learned that art, creativity itself, had been weaponized to win a war. Interviews and Memories. In 1985, a documentary filmmaker named Rick Baer interviewed several surviving members of the Ghost Army. Their voices trembled with age, but their memories remained sharp. One veteran recalled a night near Luxembourg when German artillery opened fire on their position. He and his team had been inflating dummy tanks under the moonlight. "We hit the ground," he said, "and I remember thinking, if they ever find out what we're doing, we'll be the laughingstock of the whole US Army." Another veteran, a sound engineer, said quietly, "We weren't trained to fight. We were trained to fall. But it was just as dangerous. If they caught us, they wouldn't have treated us like regular soldiers." There was laughter in some of the memories, too, stories of tanks collapsing in the wind, of local farmers staring in confusion at rubber artillery guns, of enemy planes wasting precious ammunition bombing inflatable vehicles. But beneath the humor, there was always a current of pride. They knew what they'd done had mattered. And as the Cold War deepened, military strategists quietly studied their techniques, applying their lessons to modern deception and counterintelligence. The moral dimension. The Ghost Army story isn't just one of cleverness, it's a moral reflection on the nature of war itself. They proved that intelligence, creativity, and illusion could save lives, that victory could be achieved not only through firepower, but through imagination. For soldiers who had seen death too closely, that mattered. Many of them carried that belief home, that if deception could save a soldier's life, then truth, when peace came, should preserve it. Some became teachers, teaching art to a new generation. Others painted the landscapes of France, the same fields where they had once staged illusions. When asked why they had done it, one man said simply, "Because we'd seen too much killing. If we could win with trickery instead of blood, we'd take that every time." The long-awaited recognition. For more than 70 years, the Ghost Army remained one of the war's best-kept secrets. Then, in March 2022, President Joe Biden signed the Ghost Army Congressional Gold Medal Act, officially honoring the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops and the 3,133rd Signal Company for their extraordinary service. The medal's design shows two soldiers crouched beside an inflatable tank, one holding a radio, the other a paintbrush. Around them, the inscription reads, "Deception, Creativity, Courage." At the ceremony, held in Washington, D.C., the few surviving members, men now in their late 90s, stood to receive their nation's thanks. They were frail, but when the medal was placed in their hands, their eyes shone with the same spark that once lit the French countryside with noise and imagination. The crowd rose in applause. It was the recognition they had never sought, but had always deserved. What it all meant looking back, historians now agree that the Ghost Army's operations shortened the war in Europe and saved countless lives, not through direct combat, but through confusion, delay, and fear. Their deceptions tied down German units, forced misallocations of resources, and opened paths for real divisions to strike elsewhere. But their legacy is larger than tactics. It's about what their story says about America itself, a nation that found victory not only in might, but in creativity. In the midst of the most destructive war in human history, these men reminded the world that even the tools of art, sound, color, illusion, could be weapons for peace. Final reflections. When the last of the Ghost Army veterans were asked what they wanted people to remember, one man answered quietly, "We showed that art can save lives." That imagination isn't just for beauty, it's for survival. It's a truth that transcends generations. In a century defined by technology and firepower, their legacy endures as a reminder that human ingenuity, the ability to think, to create, to deceive for good, remains one of the most powerful forces on Earth. Epilogue. The stage lights fade in the end. The Ghost Army was never meant to be remembered. Their greatest triumph was their invisibility. But history has a way of catching up to its ghosts. Today, if you walk through the quiet fields near Viersen or Bettemborg, you might still find the faint traces of tire tracks that led nowhere. You might imagine the low hum of compressors, the distant echo of fake engines, or the laughter of young men who dared to trick an empire. And in that stillness, you understand what they achieved. They fought not to destroy, but to deceive. Not to conquer, but to protect. And in doing so, they left behind a story unlike any other, a story of how a handful of artists and dreamers helped win the greatest war in history.